Hello, viewers. Welcome to today's live. In this live, I will be reading Chapter 8 Heredity, taken from Class 10 Science NCERT, followed in the CBSE board. In case you are interested in hearing the audio of first 7 chapters, a playlist has already been uploaded. As the video is clear to everybody, let's begin with the reading of Chapter 8 Heredity, Class 10 Science. We have been seen that reproductive processes give rise to new individuals that are similar but subtly different. We have discussed how some amount of variation is produced even during asexual reproduction, and the number of successful variations are maximized by the process of sexual reproduction. If we observe a field of sugarcane, we find very little variations among the individual plants. But in a number of animals, including human beings, which reproduce sexually, quite distinct variations are visible among different individuals. In this chapter, we shall be studying the mechanism by which variations are created and inherited. 8.1 Accumulation of variation during reproduction. Inheritance from the previous generation provides both a common basic body design and subtle changes in it for the next generation. Now think about what would happen when this new generation in its turn reproduces. The second generation will have differences that they inherit from the first generation as well as newly created differences as seen in figure 8.1 given on the left, this one. Figure 8.1 would represent the situation if a single individual reproduces, as happens in asexual reproduction. If one bacterium divides and then the resultant two bacteria divides again, the four individual bacteria generated would be very similar. There would be only very minor differences between them, generated due to small inaccuracies in DNA copying. However, if sexual reproduction is involved, even greater diversity will be generated, as we will see when we discuss the rules of inheritance. Do all these variation in a species have equal chances of surviving in the environment in which they find themselves? Obviously not. Depending on the nature of variations, different individuals would have different kinds of advantages. Bacteria that can withstand heat will survive better in a heat wave, as we have discussed earlier. Selection of variants by environmental factors forms the basis of evolutionary processes, as we will discuss in later sections. Rudra Meenal Official, hi, welcome to this live. Questions in text questions. If a trait A exists in 10% of a population of an asexually reproducing species and a trait B exists in 60% of the same population, which trait is likely to have arisen earlier? Question number 2. How does the creation of variations in a species promote survival? Jitesh ji, hi. Welcome to this live reading session of online biology tutorials. 8.2 Heredity. The most obvious outcome of the reproductive process still remains the generation of individuals of similar design. The rules of heredity determine the process by which traits and characteristics are reliably inherited. Let us take a closer look at these rules. 8.2.1 Inherited traits. What exactly do we mean by similarities and differences? We know that a child bears all the basic features of a human being. However, it does not look exactly like its parents, and human populations show a great deal of variation. Activity 8.1. Observe the ears of all the students in the class. Prepare a list of students having free or attached earlobes and calculate the percentage of students having each, as shown in figure 8.2. Find out about the earlobes of the parents of each student in the class. Correlate the earlobe type of each student with that of their parents. Based on this evidence, suggest a possible rule for the inheritance of earlobe types. 8.2.2 Rules for the inheritance of traits, Mendel's contributions. The rules for inheritance of such traits in human beings are related to the fact that both the father and the mother contribute practically equal amounts of genetic material to the child. This means that each trait can be influenced by both paternal and maternal DNA. Thus, for each trait, there will be two versions in each child. What will then the trait seen in the child be? Mendel, C. Box, worked out the main rules of such inheritance, and it is interesting to look at some of his experiments from more than a century ago. The figure that has been given to you in 8.2, these are the free earlobes, and these are the attached earlobes. The lowest part of the ear, called the earlobe, is closely attached to the side of the head in some of us and not in others. Free and attached earlobes are two variants found in the human population. Next page. Here they are letting you know about Gregor John Mendel. So this man seen here, he is Gregor John Mendel. Mendel was educated in a monastery and went on to study science and mathematics at the University of Vienna. Failure in the examination for a teaching certificate did not suppress his zeal for scientific quest. He went back to his monastery and started growing peas. Many others had studied the inheritance of traits in peas and other organisms earlier. But Mendel blended his knowledge of science and mathematics and was the first one to keep count of individuals exhibiting a particular trait in each generation. This helped him to arrive at the laws of inheritance. Mendel used a number of contrasting visible characters of garden peas: round, wrinkled seeds, tall, short plants, white, violet flowers, and so on. He took pea plants with different characteristics, a tall pea plant and a short plant, produced progeny by crossing them, and calculated the percentages of tall or short progeny. In the first place, there were no halfway characteristics in this first generation, or F1 progeny, no medium height plants. All plants were tall. This meant that only one of the parental traits was seen, not some mixture of the two. So the next question was, were the tall plants in the F1 generation exactly the same as the tall plants of the parent generation? Mendelian experiments test this by getting both the parental plants and these F1 tall plants to reproduce by self pollination. The progeny of the parental plants are, of course, all tall. However, the second generation or the F2 generation of the F1 plants are not all tall. Instead, one quarter of them are short. This indicates that both the tallness and the shortness traits were inherited in the F1 plants, but only the tallness traits was expressed. This led to Mendel to propose that two copies of factor, now called genes, controlling traits are present in sexually reproducing organism. These two may be identical or may be different depending on the percentage, parentage. A pattern of inheritance can be worked out with this assumption as shown in figure 8.3. Activity 8.2 in figure 8.3, what experiment would we do to confirm that the F2 generation did in fact have a 1 is to 2 is to 1 ratio of capital T, capital T, capital T, and small t trait combinations? Last paragraph of this page. In this explanation, both capital T and capital T are tall plants, while only small t is a short plant. In other words, a single copy of capital T is enough to make the plant tall, while both copies have to be small t for the plant to be short. Traits like capital T are called dominant traits, while those that behave like small t are called recessive traits. Work out which trait would be considered dominant and which one recessive in figure 8.4. Students, if you are, by the way, interested in explanatory videos of this heredity chapter, you can visit the playlist of my channel. I have already recorded the explanatory videos of heredity along with few word problems as well that are given in the sample papers. What happens when pea plants showing two different characteristics rather than just one are bred with each other? What do the progeny of a tall plant with round seeds and a short plant with wrinkled seeds look like? There are they are all tall and have round seeds. Tallness and round seeds are thus dominant traits, but what happens when these F1 progeny are used to generate F2 progeny by self-pollination? A Mendelian experiment will find that some F2 progeny are tall plants with round seeds and some were short plants with wrinkled seeds. However, there would also be some F2 progeny that showed new combinations. Some of them would be tall but have wrinkled seeds, while others would be short but have round seeds. You can see as to how new combinations of traits are formed in F2 offspring when factors controlling for seed shape and seed color recombine to form zygote leading to form F2 offspring. Figure 8.5. Thus the tall or short trait and the round seed or the wrinkled seed trait are independently inherited. 8.2.3. How do these traits get expressed? How does the mechanism of heredity work? Cellular DNA is the information source for making proteins in the cell. A section of DNA that provides information for one protein is called the gene for that protein. How do proteins control the characteristics that we are discussing here? Let us take the example of tallness as a characteristic. We know that plants have hormones that can trigger growth. Plant height can thus dependent on the amount of particular plant hormone. The amount of plant hormone made will depend on the efficiency of the process for making it. Consider now an enzyme that is important for this process. If this enzyme works efficiently, a lot of hormone will be made and the plant will be tall. If the gene for that enzyme has an alteration that makes the enzyme less efficient, the amount of hormone will be less and the plant will be short. Thus, genes control characteristics or traits. If the interpretations of Mendelian experiments we have been discussing are correct, then both parents must be contributing equally to the DNA of the progeny during sexual reproduction. We have discussed this issue in the previous chapter. If both parents can help determine the trait in the progeny, both parents must be contributing a copy of the same gene. This means that each pea plant have two sets of all the genes, one inherited from each parent. From this mechanism to work, each germ cell must have only one gene set. How do germ cells make a single set of genes from the normal two copies that all others in the body have? If the progeny plant inherited a single whole gene set from each parent, then the experiment explained in figure 8.5 cannot work. This is because the two characteristics capital R and small y would then be linked to each other and cannot be independently inherited. This is explained by the fact that each gene set is present not as a single long thread of DNA but as separate independent pieces, each called a chromosome. Thus, each cell will have two copies of each chromosome, one each from the male and the female parents. Every germ cell will take one chromosome from each pair, and these may be either maternal or paternal origin. When two germ cells combine, they will restore the normal number of chromosomes in the progeny, ensuring the stability of the DNA of the species. Such a mechanism of inheritance explains the results of the Mendel experiments and is used by all sexually reproducing organisms. But Asexually reproducing organisms also follow similar rules of inheritance. Can we work out how their inheritance might work? 8.2.4 Sexual sex determination. We have discussed the idea that the two sexes participating in sexual reproduction must be somewhat different from each other for a number of reasons. How is the sex of a newborn individual determined? Different species use very different strategies for this. Some rely entirely on environmental cues. Thus, in some animals, like a few reptiles, the temperature of which fertilized eggs are kept determine whether the animals developing in the eggs will be male or female. In other animals, such as snails, individual can change sex, indicating that sex is not genetically determined. However, in human beings, the sex of the individual is largely genetically determined. In other words, the genes inherited from our parents decide whether we are will be boys or girls. But so far, we have assumed that different similar gene sets are inherited from both parents. If that is the case, how can genetic inheritance of determine the sex? The explanation lies in the fact that all human chromosomes are not paired. Most human chromosomes have a maternal and a paternal copy, and we have 22 such pairs. But one pair, called the sex chromosomes, is odd in not always being a perfect pair. Women have a perfect pair of sex chromosomes, both called X, but men have a mismatched pair in which one is normal sized X while the other is a short one called Y. So, women are XX while men are XY. Now, can we work out what the inheritance pattern of X and Y will be? In figure 8.6 shows half the children will be boys and half will be the girls. All children will inherit an X chromosome from their mother regardless of whether they are boys or girls. Thus the sex of the children will be determined by what they inherited from their father. A child who inherits an X chromosome from her father will be a girl, and one who inherits a Y chromosome from him will be a boy. So every time when a woman is pregnant, there is 50% probability of having a girl child and 50% probability of having a boy child. In case you are interested in hearing or watching the explanatory videos of the heredity chapter, you can come to the playlist. There are few word-based problems also are given that might help you. First in-text question: how do Mendel's experiments show that traits may be dominant or recessive? 2. How do Mendel's experiments show that traits are inherited independently? 3. A man with blood group A marries a woman with blood group O and their daughter has blood group O. Is this information enough to tell you which of the traits, blood group A or O, is dominant? Why or why not? So this type of question, blood group question, has also been explained in the explanatory videos where all the four blood types are being given along with the word problem. So even it is interesting because in case you want to work out for your blood group, then you can also find out your siblings' blood group by doing the example that I have explained in the explanatory videos in the playlist part of the channel, and it will be named as Heredity. How is the sex of the child determined in human beings? What you have learned. Variations arising during the process of reproduction can be inherited. These variations may lead to increased survival of the individuals. Sexually reproducing individuals have two copies of genes for the same trait. If the copies are not identical, the trait that gets expressed is called dominant trait and the other is called the recessive trait. Traits in one individual may be inherited separately, giving rise to new combinations of traits in the offspring of sexual reproduction. Sex is determined by different factors in various species. In human beings, the sex of the child depends on whether the paternal is chromosome is X. Paternal means the one that is from the father's side, or Y for boys. So with this was a short chapter only in the NCERT. However, in explanation, This is quite big. The major part of the explanation has not been given in Heredity chapter of class 10 science. In case you are interested in going through the explanatory videos, you can visit the playlist section of my channel. So here we are done. In case it was helpful, you can consider subscribing. See you in next video. Thanks for connecting.